For as long as humanity has sailed the seas, ships have gone missing under mysterious circumstances. And in today's video, we'll be looking at 3 such examples from across history. Well, technically 6 ships, but one case is another example that has to be bundled together, which is an interesting story in its own right when you think about it. Regardless, these are just 3 examples. There are many, many more cases out there. Enough for an entire video series, if I was being honest. For now, let's begin with the one submarine on this list, possibly the most famous missing sub in history. And also the weirdest ship on this list, the French submarine Surcouf. The kind of sub that could only come about when people were still experimenting with the type. Because Surcouf was a cruiser submarine, with an emphasis on cruiser as she carried 2 massive 8-inch or 203mm guns. Laid down on July 1st, 1927, and launched on November 18th, 1929, she was intended to be the first of a class of 3. This would not come to pass because while she was fitting out, the London Naval Treaty was signed in 1930. The very idea that Surcouf had been built for, massive submarines with massive guns, was now restricted. Probably a good thing because the submarine had some distinct issues actually using her guns. However, beyond that point, the particulars of her design can be seen in her dedicated video. For the purposes of this one, we'll look at Surcouf's ultimate fate. For a Cliff Notes version of those events. After France began to lose the land war, Surcouf limped to Britain and apparent safety. This would result on July 3, 1940, in the British seizing the boat as part of their general effort to keep the French fleet in friendly hands, or at least out of the German hands. 4 men, 3 British and 1 French, were killed in this altercation. Surcouf, meanwhile, would pass on to the Free French. Throughout her service, the loyalty of the submarine and her crew was constantly being called into question, to the point the British insisted on keeping a liaison on board, presumably to keep an eye on the French. In any event, Surcouf would spend most of her wartime service around the east coast of North America, before, in early 1942, being reassigned to the Pacific after the Japanese declaration of war. In the course of sailing to the Pacific, the submarine vanished on the night of February 18, 1942, north of Panama. Exactly what happened to her at this point is something of a mystery. Conspiracy theories abound, including that she vanished in the Bermuda Triangle. We'll ignore that one because the submarine's most commonly accepted sinking location is nowhere near that patch of ocean. The most likely explanation comes from one of 2 things. First, that she was rammed and sunk by an American freighter. This ship reported hitting a submerged object that ground against her side and bottom. There's also some reference to her crew hearing cries for help in English as they sailed away, thinking that they had hit a U-boat. However, the Germans have no records of a U-boat in that area, so while it's not impossible, it is highly unlikely the freighter hit a German submarine. On the other hand, the damage to the freighter was actually fairly light. If she had hit something the size of Surcouf, one imagines it would have been very obvious when the ship was dry docked for repair. An alternative option is that the French submarine was a victim of friendly fire. Both a PBY Catalina and a bomber formation from Panama have been cited as attacking a large submarine at around the same time, February 19th, 1942. It's entirely possible that one or even both of those are true and that the sub was Surcouf. It's even possible that Surcouf was rammed by the freighter, damaged, and then attacked twice over as she limped towards Panama for repair. Not likely, but also not impossible, even if it is something of a conga line of misfortune for the poor French boat. Rammed by a freighter, bombed by a seaplane, and bombed by a formation of bombers before finally sinking at some point. Definitely not fun. This is still more likely in any event than the conspiracy theory that she was caught supplying a U-boat in late 1941, and in turn sunk by American submarines. In classic conspiracy theory fashion, that rather ignores that she was in service well past that point. The other notable conspiracy theory, meanwhile, involves the boat hiding in Martinique until May 1942, when she would be sunk trying to sneak back to France by another PBY Catalina. For now, however, her fate remains a mystery. And with that covered, we can move on to the next example. That being SS Waratah, a passenger and cargo ship built for the route between Europe and Australia. Launched in 1908, she entered into passenger service right at the heyday of the ocean liner, when ships like Lusitania were plying the far more lucrative North Atlantic route. These were the days of grand ships floating hotels racing across the Atlantic, and also the days of smaller, less luxurious ships sailing to South America, Africa, or Australia. Waratah was one of those ships. While by no means a cheap or bad vessel, she was much smaller than the more famous Cunard or White Star Line ships, roughly 10,000 tons and 465 feet long, with space for about 400 passengers between first and third class, although she was technically only certified for around 250. However, in classic Australia route fashion, Waratah could convert cargo spaces to carry nearly 700 more passengers in questionable comfort. When it came to speed, she could make a modest 13 or so knots, perfectly fine for the long trek between Europe and the land down under, where speed wasn't a huge concern. However, Waratah would not have a long career on that route. Her maiden voyage was on November 5, 1908. By July of 1909, she had vanished without a trace. On the return trip from Australia, the steamer anchored in Durban, South Africa. This was on July 25, 1909. At the time, a passenger, Claude Sawyer, left the ship. He claimed to have been nervous about the vessel, finding her to be top-heavy, and to have had dreams of a mysterious man that he took as a sign to leave the ship. Regardless, Waratah left Durban on July 26, 1909, and would never reach Cape Town, her next destination. 211 souls were on board between passengers and crew. The last time the ship was seen, that can be confirmed, was on July 27th, when she overhauled another steamer. This ship, Clan McIntyre, sent routine signal lamp messages to Waratah. Even at her relatively stately 13 knots, Waratah overtook Clan McIntyre and vanished over the horizon at around 9:30 that morning. This was the last time we can be certain of anyone seeing the steamer, because later that day, the weather became terrible, eventually developing into a cyclone by the next day. Waratah sailed into that storm and vanished. At this point, unconfirmed sightings abound. Another ship, the Harlow, claimed to see smoke on the horizon around 5 to 6 p.m. on the 27th. Enough smoke that the captain reported thinking the other ship was on fire. The same captain then saw two bright flashes in the darkness later that night, in the same area as the other ship's running lights. After the disappearance of Waratah, this sighting was used as evidence of an explosion or multiple such explosions being the explanation for her sinking. Another vessel reported passing a ship towards midnight on the 27th. They exchanged signals by lamp, although the weather was already verging on terrible. So all the crew could make out was TAH from the mystery ship's name, supposedly the last three letters. While a third apparent sighting came from ashore. A mounted rifleman, Edward Conker, claimed to have seen a ship through a telescope while on an exercise on July 28th. The ship, which matched Waratah's description, was struggling southwest in heavy seas. The ship rolled to starboard and was then hit by a heavy wave that rolled her over completely. It was over quickly as the ship vanished from sight. Conker recorded this in his diary and apparently reported it at camp, but nothing came of it. He only told the story in 1929, 20 years after the ship vanished. And finally, in August 1909, another steamship reported seeing bodies in a river near Waratah's last confirmed sighting. Yet another ship claimed to see bodies in the water more than 2 weeks after the steamer vanished. All of these unconfirmed sightings are just that, unconfirmed. To this day, Waratah remains missing. In 1999, a ship was located that initially seemed to be her. However, an expedition in 2001 indicated the wreck was an unrelated ship lost in World War II. Various explanations have been put forward in the century since the sinking to explain what happened. From a rogue wave rolling over an already unstable ship to an explosion based on the Harlow sighting. The most likely option is that the ship simply foundered in the incredibly rough weather. Had she rolled over or otherwise been dragged under fast enough, there wouldn't have been time to launch boats or for much wreckage to rise to the surface. Moreover, in the kind of conditions at the time, most of the crew, and certainly all the passengers, would have been below deck, trapped inside as the ship went under. Regardless of if she capsized, got caught between the swells, or was swamped by a rogue wave, nothing major was ever found from the ship. In any case, let's move to the final example. This is the 341 example involving sister ships vanishing in more or less the same way, including one of the most famous missing ships in history. Now, any list of ship disappearances can't be made without at least mentioning USS Cyclops. Not because her disappearance is anything unique, but because she is simply the vanished ship in popular imagination. In large part due to theories bandied about years or even decades after she actually vanished. Many of which range from remotely feasible and into pseudoscience because of the enduring myth of the Bermuda Triangle, which itself became more popular because of Cyclops, a cycle feeding into itself in a lot of ways. I was admittedly leery of including her as an actual example for this reason. As popular as she may be, Cyclops is centered in a lot of the more silly stories about the Bermuda Triangle. However, this example isn't just about Cyclops. This example is about Cyclops and two of her sister ships, the Proteus class of colliers, of which 4 were built and 3 vanished in more or less the same manner, and in a similar location at that. The one exception to the rule, USS Jupiter, was converted into USS Langley, the first aircraft carrier of the United States Navy. I've covered both Langley and the Proteus class in their own videos. I'll link both in the description. As for the other three, well, I suppose starting with Cyclops is the way to go. Launched in 1910, she was a fairly typical collier of the time. A ship designed to cart coal around and supply other ships and bases in the days before oil became the main fuel. This she did well and without complaint from 1910 until 1917. Upon the entrance of the United States into the Great War, Cyclops was commissioned into the fleet proper on May 1st, 1917. Prior to this, she had served with the Naval Auxiliary Service. Her service in the Great War was fairly minor, all things being equal. She spent most of it, a couple exceptions aside, puttering about the East Coast, until February 1918, when the ship was sent to Brazil to supply British ships in the South Atlantic. When that was done, Cyclops was loaded up with manganese ore instead of coal, 11,000 tons of the stuff that she took aboard in Brazil. On February 22nd, the ship set sail for Baltimore, Maryland. It should be noted that her normal maximum capacity, and this was coal and not manganese, would have been 8,000 tons. Cyclops was dangerously overloaded. Moreover, her starboard engine had a cracked cylinder and was, as a result, inoperable. Still, she limped along, eventually making a stopover in Barbados in March 1918. When Cyclops left on March 4th, it was never to be seen again. The wild theories almost immediately began. For example, that the captain had pro-German sympathies and stacked the ship with German sympathizers, intending to hand her over to Germany. While the captain was German, and by all indications an incredible jerk, this is unlikely. German records don't indicate anything of this nature, or of a U-boat attack for that matter. Ignoring the more outlandish theories related to the Bermuda Triangle, like time travel or alien abduction, the most likely option is simply that Cyclops was overloaded. If the weather got bad enough, it could have capsized her or snapped her clean in two. All the latter would have taken was waves spread far enough apart to leave the middle of the ship unsupported. It's made more likely by the fate of her sister ships. Proteus, the second ship lost after Cyclops, had been sold into Canadian civilian service in 1941. She was lost without a trace, carrying bauxite ore sometime after November 23, 1941. She likely sank somewhere in the Caribbean around November 23rd through 25th, though no one knows for sure. The third of the sisters to be lost, Nereus, vanished on a similar route and duty. She was also carrying bauxite ore under Canadian ownership in the Caribbean. This time, at some point after December 10th, 1941. As you can see, all three of these ships were lost doing more or less the same thing, carrying heavy ore that they weren't intended for along more or less the same general route. Not identical, but similar. One could call the class cursed, I suppose, aside from Jupiter. One could also point out, rightfully, that when you load ships up with heavy ore like this, things could go wrong. In the case of Proteus and Nereus, they were also old ships, 30-year-old colliers, possibly overloaded, sinking in rough weather. That is entirely likely. In any event, these three ships remain a mystery until and unless wreckage is found. No German records have been located from either war indicating submarine attack. The most likely answer is the simplest one. Overloaded ships sank in rough weather. And with that, we come to the end of this extra video. I might do more of these in the future, but that's for later. Thank you for watching, Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.